station. Its programs and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. And joining us today is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Welcome to the program. I almost didn't get it off here this morning.
Yeah, I was a little worried.
Skype was not working at all, and I had to restart at 57.
I know what that's like.
So here we are. We have a great show in store. We're going to be talking about the Antarctic deception and some of the Arctic ice fear-mongering, fear porn nonsense in the first half. And then the second half of the show, we're going to get into a very fascinating topic, which really began being spearheaded by Brian Forster 15 years ago or so. He picked up work that had been disregarded in the 20s, and he began examining the elongated skulls in the Paracas region. Through his studies, he found that elongated skulls exist all over the planet. Like they're literally all over Mesoamerica, all the way up into North America. There were even a tribe in North America called the Flathead people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and all over Europe, all over Russia, all over everywhere, Asia, on and on. We've got this phenomenon of people on purpose elongating skulls of their children. Sometimes it's related to nobility or the ruling class, but in other cases, it's cultural. The whole society's doing it to emulate something. We don't know what it is. But the good news is that after 5 years of stalling and scientists retracting papers and hiding information from Brian Forster, he finally got the DNA data, and we're going to discuss it with you, and I believe you're going to find it quite fascinating.
Well, and don't forget, too, that we have to make the distinction between the elongated skulls that are a result of cranial deformation versus the elongated skulls that are not and appear to be genetically that way.
Yeah, I don't know if there's really a lot of evidence to support that, but there appears to be, in Brian's case, a number of skulls that should be able to be investigated are now missing.
Right.
Yes, so
But there are very distinct physical differences, right, between cranial deformation skulls and what appear to be natural elongated skulls.
Yes, indeed, but I think there's processes to get both.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Some of the claims of Forster are incorrect, like the lack of sagittal lines or something like that. That happens in humans. It happens with aging. Yeah, and I have a paper I can bring that up. So it's not exceptional. Also, his claim of 1,500 cc's being exceptional is incorrect. That's average for a normal Homo sapien cranium. So he's got some problems with the things that he has. And even the position of the hole where the spinal cord, that alters in humans as well based on race and genetics. And there's even some genetic disorders that move it all the way to the back of the skull.
Right. Well, we'll get into all of this. I have some counter arguments for you, but anyway.
Yeah, so let's start by sharing the screen here, if we can even do that. Let me know when you see global warming is threatening Antarctica's meteorites.
I see it. What?
I don't think I gave you this one, but
no, you didn't.
Certainly a good way to kick off the show. This is some of the nonsense we're going to be talking about that the mainstream media publishes about the Antarctic catastrophic ice loss and the Arctic catastrophic ice loss, both of which are based on zero science and 100% propaganda. The fact that global warming is threatening Antarctica's meteorites initially makes zero sense because the continent of Antarctica is below zero the entire year. So There are sections that do get above freezing in the northwestern corner, Maudland and areas like that that approach South America. That has to do with ocean currents, and those areas have always been warm. In fact, 5,000 years ago, they were so warm, there was a whole different biome in that area because it was much warmer than today in that region. But overall, Antarctica at the same time had more ice. That's a conundrum.
Right. Right.
So they'd simply make any headline they want. And this is the Washington Post, which is owned by, isn't that Bezos?
Yes. Or did he sell it?
The penis rocket man?
It was at least owned by him at some point. I can't remember. Did he sell it?
Regardless, it's no longer considered what it was once in its heyday.
No, it's which is such a tragedy. You know, all of these once great newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post are just such trash now.
Yeah, what's funny is that the subtitle is the only truthful aspect of the entire article. The continent is home to Earth's largest concentration of objects from outer space. Yes, that's true. And they're all trapped in ice. If you didn't know, Antarctica has almost, some estimate 95% of all the fresh water locked up in ice is in Antarctica. Let that sink in, 95%. Right. So all the rest of all the glaciers here and in the Arctic and in the mountains are only 5%.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so they're saying that global warming, it's only like 2 paragraphs, is threatening the meteorites. So the reason that the argument would be here is the Earth is burning up and the meteorites are now being lost to the ocean by falling into the sea. But I don't know of any groups of people walking around ice sheets looking for meteorites. That's what's weird.
Well, of course.
This is hundreds of thousands of square miles of ice sheet you'd have to walk around.
Yeah. But you know, you gotta say something to get people alarmed, right? So they obviously, somebody came up with this idea and was like, "Ooh, let's put this out there."
Yeah, and this is following headlines earlier in the week that scientists are in disbelief. Antarctica is behaving in a way they've never seen before. Can it recover?
Yeah.
So what happened was last year there was an anomalous warm portion of the year. But when I mean warm, I still mean minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right. When ice still doesn't melt.
Right. And here is another article that just came out, Antarctic sea ice near historic lows. Yeah. The reason that they can publish this is that their data set is 23 years long.
That's exactly how they get away with this. It's completely out of context, right? Like, I mean, you sent me another article talking about how in reality, there's more sea ice now than in Antarctica than there was 5,000 years ago. So if you look at it in that time frame, that becomes very clear. But if you look at it in the short time frame of 23 years, it's like, oh my God.
Well,
it's never been this low. And it's like, how can you determine that from a data set that's only 23 years old?
So like I said, last year, there was an anomalous low temperature, the second lowest in their 20-year set, which means absolutely nothing because they don't have enough data.
Yeah.
They continue in this article to say Arctic ice continues to decline. Now, the only problem with that is that the graph that they show right below that headline shows the current position of Antarctic ice, which is in the 30-year average.
Right.
They do show the last year's low ice here, but that only lasted for like 8 months here and several months here. So it was just an anomalous year of their very limited 23-year data set. And what they're showing in the article is that this year ice is absolutely normal.
Right. And they show that the lowest minimum in their data set was in 2012. So where's the alarm?
Yeah, it's like, especially because on the state of the ice right now. Now, I had to reset all this, so I'm going to have to reboot all of these websites. But here you can come over to the actual fearmonger sites themselves, which is the NSIDC, and you can see that anomalous year, 2012, right in front of you in the red dashed line. That's the record minimum, but that also coincides with solar maximum on Earth.
Yeah.
The highest solar output ever in the last several hundred years occurred on this date, where you would expect to see some things to be anomalous, like this particular sea ice extent, where it was only for this period, it was completely normal for these 6 months, and then there was an anomaly. That's what we call an anomaly. It has nothing to do with what's actually going on.
Right.
Because here we are 13 years later, and this is the Arctic sea ice is exactly the same as it has been for the last 40 years. Let me bring up some of this. This is from Tony Heller, and this is coming out this week. There is more Arctic sea ice, or there's more sea ice around Antarctica than there was in 1980, 1981, 1988, 2006, 2011, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2022, and 23. And yet we've got that headline that we're all going to die.
I was really laughing for a couple of reasons. I think it was the Live Science article that we showed. Number one, the way that they get around the issue of the fact that the temperatures are still well below 0°C, and that ice can't melt, is they start talking about the albedo effect, right? They're like, oh, well, it's breaking up, and the more that happens, the more the warming is accelerated, blah, 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 blah. But also, I think it was this article. I can't find it now. Maybe it was a different article, but something you sent me. They're talking about the AMOC shutting down.
Oh, yeah.
And they're really concerned about that for Antarctica. But yet at the very end of the article, they say, well, if the AMOC shuts down, then the concern is that Europe is going to get a lot colder.
Yep.
Yeah, it will. It'll get colder.
Yep.
I mean, it's unbelievably inconsistent and stupid and ridiculous.
Yeah. The last time that happened, we were at glacial maximum, and there were glaciers all the way up into Northern Europe.
Right. But yet they're going to call this the world is burning up. And it's like, what? I mean, it's so funny, too, because it's right at the end of the article. I can't believe I can't find this now. I've been trying to find it for like 10 minutes. And no one reads that far. And even if they do, I'd say the general public that believes this stuff is so brainwashed that that wouldn't even register as being ironic. It's like, what?
Yeah, so here's the article. Antarctica is currently colder than it was 5,000 years ago. Not only that, there's evidence that Antarctica has been cooling for hundreds of years, but we'll get to that later. So in this article, Antarctica is currently colder than it was 5,000 years ago, like we said. According to a new study, about 6,000 years ago, Antarctica's Collins Glacier frontline was a full 1 kilometer southwest of its current extent. The frontline advanced to today's extent in about 5,000 years. So the glacier is growing.
Yeah. Yeah.
This has a lot to do with the fact that right now it's not as warm as it was thousands of years ago. We had times called the medieval warm, the Roman warm, and even the Holocene optimum. That was like 7,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is posited to be up to 5 degrees warmer than today. But we're all going to burn up if it warms up 2 degrees. It's complete insanity.
Yeah. Well, and this article also raises another very important point, which is about elephant seals, right? Who cannot survive in areas where there's a lot of sea ice. So there have been times in history where there's been enormous elephant seal populations in Antarctica, meaning that it was in many respects free of sea ice. Today, there are no elephant seals in Antarctica, and the particular what's the particular genetic population of elephant seals from Antarctica is basically gone at this point. Yet the other article from Live Science that's raising the alarm about global warming is screaming about the emperor penguin chicks that died in like 2022 or whatever it was. And it's
too
like
cold.
It's like, well, maybe, yeah, but guess what? This happens naturally. Animals go extinct. There are variations in the population numbers and locations, and this happens naturally with natural climate change.
Yeah, so let that sink
Like
in.
you got to pick. Do you want to save the emperor penguins or the elephant seals? Because you have to pick one.
Right. So let that sink in. 5,000 years ago, the Ross Sea was sufficiently ice-free to allow for huge elephant seal populations. They estimate as large as 200,000 individuals. Okay.
Yeah.
And today there are none.
Yeah.
Okay. The substantially reduced numbers of the remaining elephant seals, they had to move away from Antarctica, and they only survive on sub-Antarctic islands like South Georgia and Macquarie, which is about 20 degrees further north in latitude. So they had to move a whole great distance towards the equator just to live.
Yeah. And it's not even the same population genetically.
Yeah.
The other population is gone. It's lost. That's it. Done.
Yeah, it says the genetically distinct VLC elephant seal population has tragically died off.
Right.
And this is due to the modern cooling gradient and ice cover expansion. So if we're talking about 5,000 years, we have this massive expansion of ice, massive cooling in Antarctica that pushes elephant seal populations 23 degrees towards the equator. That is a huge climatic change.
Yeah.
And yet they're using a 23-year data set to say that we're all going to die because Antarctica is, it's unprecedented what's happening there.
Right. Again, because based on the assumption that things have always been as they were in the last 23 years, even though the geological record shows that that is absolutely not the case.
Yeah. In fact, the Antarctica hasn't always been covered in ice. Geologically speaking, it's quite recent. The continent that lay over the South Pole without freezing over for 100 million years occurred about, well, the beginning of Antarctic ice, some postulate to be around 40 million years ago, the first glaciers formed. Some say 34 million years ago. But it's been continuously frozen for 34 million years.
It's a long
Of which 95% of all freshwater ice is there. And people don't understand, we're not talking about the sea ice. We're talking about the ice on the continent.
Yeah.
And so the media has been saying the sea ice, we're losing sea ice. We lose all of the sea ice in the summer every year. It almost recedes back to zero. And then by the winter, it extends hundreds of thousands of square miles of sea ice every year. This is a cycle, but I don't think people understand that.
You know, there's a mention in that Live Science article too about how, you know, the fear is that if all the sea ice melts, then all of the land ice will slip off into the ocean. It's just like, why? Is there like a giant in the middle of Antarctica pushing it into the ocean?
The difference is that the continent of Antarctica is freezing. It is warm on the coast because of the water. And ocean water that's not frozen is warm compared to minus 50 in the air. And so the sea ice melts because of the currents. It has nothing to do with the ambient air temperature. It is freezing in Antarctica. And it's been freezing there for 34 million years.
Right.
And people believe that the earth tilts, for goodness sakes.
And when they talk about the process of the sea ice melting, like the way they're describing it is always like it's completely unprecedented. But as we've hammered home many times, I mean, it happens every year.
Yeah.
It's like
and here's an article that the ice in Antarctica has melted before. And guess when that was? When it was warm and there were elephant seals there 5,000 years ago.
Right. Right.
It says the ice sheet in Queen Maudland in East Antarctica is not stable. Large amounts of ice have melted in the past, most recently 5,000 years ago. Yet the media claims that what's happening today, the warming in West Antarctica, is unprecedented. I guess they did zero research.
Well, of course not. I mean, I don't think journalists do very much research at all these days. They just continue to recycle the lines of the day, and then they make up stuff and write these articles. You know, they don't look backwards because they're not interested in any other theory because it doesn't fit in with. It's like being part of the cool kids club, you know?
It is refreshing to see people like Tony Heller, who has nothing to lose, continue to shove the facts right in the face of all of this propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah, and he doesn't give two craps about, how anybody responds to anything that he posts. He just basically doesn't respond to anything because it doesn't matter, People are going to keep coming at him for as long as this stupid narrative stays alive, which is going to be some time because it's a giant hoax. But he just ignores it.
Right, and he uses NASA and NOAA data right in your face to show that here, Arctic sea ice is identical to 35 years ago.
Right.
Which was when, by the way, we were going into an ice age.
Right. And then, there'll be some responses to this that are, completely, somebody will, claim that his data is false or that he's misinterpreting or he's cherry picking the data. It's like, no, not at all.
Yeah. Did we beat that with a dead horse? Should we?
Yeah, I think so.
So you can come over to the interactive sea ice graph yourself at nsidc.org/Arctic Sea Ice News. And you can go through all the years. You can check out if there's any trends. And what you're going to find is that, yes, the amount of sea ice has slowly changed since 1880 to present. But the data set we have only goes back to 1979. And there's a reason for that. If you look at because we had satellite data before that, they don't include it here because there was times in the 70s when there was almost no Arctic sea ice. And we have not gotten less sea ice than that time, so they can't show that data.
Right.
So by starting in 1979, they can claim that the current numbers that we're seeing are less than the numbers 20 years ago, which is true. But if they went all the way back to 1970, their sham would be exposed right in daylight.
Yeah. Something else I want to point out here too, we were talking about 2012 being an anomaly, and it's like, okay, anomalies are the reason why we have data sets in the first place, like we collect data over a period of time because there are always going to be anomalies for one reason or another. And so to really get a sense of what things are like, you have to look at that data set, which again points to how insane and ridiculous it is that the data set that's being used to talk about any of this is only 23 years old. That's crazy. Well, no, this is older than that, right?
This is Arctic. It's longer.
Oh, it's Arctic, yeah. But regardless, this is still 1979 or 75. What is it? What is
79 for this chart?
I mean, that's still, not even 50 years, and it's like that's still a very tiny data set in the history of the Earth,
Yeah, in order to even consider climate, you need 15 years of data. So this is barely enough data to call it climate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And based on that, a small change in a quarter of a degree or 1,000 cubic feet of ice, it's the end of humanity.
Right. Right.
When what we can clearly see, if you're just with your eyes, the anomalous 2012 year, here, I'm going to light it up. For the first half of the year, it was above the entire data set.
Right. Right.
So nothing is linear. This whole climate change movement considers everything only goes in one direction, similar to evolution. Like 10,000 years ago, we were dumb cavemen, and now we're these geniuses that use smartphones.
Right. Right. Also, I mean, think about it this way too. Just the math of this data set. I don't know what it is, but this represents like what 0.00001% of the history of the Earth or something. I don't know exactly what the math is, but it's such a small sliver.
Yeah, just the Holocene. It's like a thousandth of a percent of the Holocene.
Right. It's like, that's how ridiculous it is. Oh, we know everything from the last 50 years. It's like, what?
It's the hottest ever.
Well, again, also, I mean, I've said this many times, but the lack of intellectual honesty is so disgusting because it's quite easy to go look at the geological data that we have through proxy data that gives us an idea of what temperatures were like thousands of years ago. And these people aren't looking at any of that. It's so dishonest. It's disgusting.
That is the true definition of cherry picking.
Yeah, right.
Now, what's going on here? This is Peruvian, one of the first pictures of an elongated skull from the late 1800s. And it says Peruvian of the ancient race. So
interesting.
Kind of interesting. And also, I think it says, and what does that say down there?
Where's this picture from?
Lock of the bleu from the Clé de Bleu. I can't read it.
I'm trying to blow it up. I can't read that. Yeah.
So what we're going to be discussing in the second half is a fascinating topic. It's elongated skulls. If you jump down this rabbit hole, you're going to quickly find out that I would say, in my opinion, from the breadth of research I've done on this, if we were alive, let's say in 1000 BC, that the majority of land masses on Earth would have cultural populations of people with elongated skulls. Worldwide. This is not a localized phenomenon to Paracas, Peru. And in fact, I think the Paracas people, which are an enigma, nobody knows where they came from or who they are, they must have come from somewhere. And evidence shows that elongated skull cultures were all over the world, including, but not limited to, Micronesia, Indonesia, the Far East, all of Europe, all of the Levant, the Black Sea region, portions of Africa, North America, South, everywhere. And yet, do you people listening know that this is the truth? That 3,000 years ago, we had coneheads all over the world? Maybe that's why Saturday Night Live and the coneheads were so popular. It's in our genes.
Right?
Now, it's the Paracas skulls that are the most well-known because there's museums where you can go see them. The unique thing about these elongated skulls is that they have red hair. Now, many of the skeptics have claimed that the reddening of hair can occur from any hair color. And they're claiming that through time, black hair can turn red. But there have been peer-reviewed studies that have disproven that. And what I found in this research is almost all of the skeptics are doing the same thing they're claiming that Brian is doing. They're being disingenuous to just disprove him. All right, so what we know about these skulls now, because of the work of Forster, is that, and so some guy did genetic testing on this, but 3 years ago, when he found out what he found out, he then never published his paper, and Brian never got the results.
Yeah. And so now he's gone through this 5-year process to actually get the DNA results. And it's not just a 5-year process, right? It's like you have to get permission from the Peruvian government to do the testing. You've got to spend, I think he said they spent like $100,000 doing this. You've got to find labs.
Very expensive because it's high end. It was like 12,000 a sample. Right. And out of 16, only 12 came back with results, but that's a very high number.
Out of 18.
18, okay.
Out of 18, yeah. But it was like 58 samples of those 12 skulls.
Yeah.
Which is pretty good. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, definitely like a really intensive process just to get the samples so that they're really clean and perfect, and finding the labs to do it, and et cetera, et cetera.
And well, what the results show is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
And it shows that the Paracas people had Native American genetics in them from haplo A and C.
Native Americans are A, B, C, and D.
But I thought the test only showed A and C.
I don't remember that part.
Well, so the Paracas people have some native genes in it,
sure,
from some of the native cultures. But the most startling thing that they found, and the reason why the guy retracted the paper, was that they found Haplogroup H.
But it's more specific than that. Let me back up for a second too. There's four of those 12 skulls.
Yeah.
Had the most common haplogroup was haplogroup B. Period.
Which makes sense because I'm going to show you that right here on this map, a genetic map. Haplogroup B is all of the native cultures that are out in the desert Southwest here, which we hypothesize include Mayans and Incas because they were all intermixing, and the genetics proves that. Yeah. So, and this goes all the way down, this haplogroup, down the coast of the Americas into Peru and the Atacama Desert, where that desert glass is, where the Nazca lines are. And so these cultures are doing similar things with geoglyphs and petroglyphs. But the unique thing is that they also have this H group, which is from Europe.
Well, so here's the thing. I mean, the H group is a huge group.
Yeah, let's go over to this map.
So,
everywhere in this green, it could be H, all the way up into subarctic Siberia, all the way down through India, Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa, and all of Europe, even Iceland.
Yeah.
And the Vikings, let's say.
Yeah, so essentially what H is in part reflecting, and you kind of see this when you start reading about the subclades of H, because it's not just H, it's very specific what they found. They found subgroups of H. But basically what this ends up reflecting is like, thousands of years of migrations, right? So H kind of encompasses quite a lot at this point. What the most common haplogroups that were found in the other 8 skulls were the group in the 8 part as part of H is H1A and H2, which has kind of specific origins, but also UTE, which has specific origins. So H1A, which apparently is just known as H1 now. It's a little confusing too, because some of the labels have changed over time. This is a group that you would find this haplogroup in particularly the Balkan Romas. Like the Romas are the gypsies of Europe. They're like the dark-skinned gypsies that you find in Europe. And those people, you'll find them in Bulgaria, and sometimes you'll find them in Spain and Lithuania. But their origin is a specific group in India, I believe. And then H2 is different. H2 is all over Europe. It's most pointedly found in the pre-pottery Neolithic B, and it's associated with the spread of agriculture from Anatolia into Europe. So those are probably the people who built Göbekli Tepe. Like last week, we're talking about how it's quite evident that those people had established agriculture earlier than what has previously been claimed. And then the UTE group is really old. It's at least 40,000 years old. There's 2 Cro-Magnon in Russia that are one's 37,000 years old and one's 33,000 years old, and that's UTE. But what happens is UT is spread all over Central Asia, Europe, the Mideast, and North Africa, and you typically don't find it in percentages greater than 2%. But you do find it in percentages greater than 3% in specific ethnic groups in the Caucasus Mountains, which is something that Brian Forster was talking about. Otherwise, you find it in Southeast Asia. The highest concentration is in Sri Lanka. You find people with 12% of this group. But you also find it in Bangladesh and in India at 5.5%, 6%. Your mic is off. Your mic is off. Diamond, your mic is off.
Oh, yeah, we have very little time to discuss this, and I don't want to really jump forward here, but it's fascinating when we start looking at this, that this haplogroups is centered around the emergence of Cro-Magnon right in this region during the peak of the Ice Age.
Yeah.
And so we get all this information that on the edge of the ice sheet in Europe, we have huge populations of Cro-Magnon.
Yeah.
And so this is where this group is. So we're really going back in time.
Well, and the direction of travel here of these groups, right, especially UTE and H1A, is it's you go from Southeast Asia, India, that area, then you get to you get that group moving into West Asia, the Middle East, into the Caucasus, and then eventually they also spread into Eastern Europe, North Africa, and then the rest of Europe, right? Which is why you have this really dispersed haplogroups over a large region in very small quantities, right? Because there's a lot of migration that's happened since the existence of this haplogroup.
Right. And so it's showing that from India and Asia here, it's moving off of the subcontinent into Sri Lanka. And where was the 12%?
That was in Sri Lanka.
Okay. So they're moving into the only way you could be migrating here at this point is by boat because they're going across the ocean to islands.
Wait, which part of the migration are you talking about? Because,
To
you know,
jump
given
off
that
of the Asian continent onto these into these islands, Indonesia.
oh,
Yeah, you can't walk there. You have to boat there.
well, but unless, okay, so for example, haplogroup U2E, you know, since the highest concentration that we know of is in Sri Lanka, then that would seem to be more of the origin. So you're moving from somewhere like Sri Lanka to the Indian continent, then to the Middle East.
And what I'm suggesting is based on the genetics here that we were a seafaring culture 30,000 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pre-Ice Age.
Yeah, no question. No question.
And we're going to have a lot of evidence that that is the case of how the Paracas people ended up with this haplogroup right down here.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing.
They didn't come over the land bridge here.
No. And this is the thing that I find most perplexing because you know, again, the direction of migration seems to be, you know, India into the Middle East and then into the Caucasus and Europe, right? But then it's sometime after that, because this is only like 3,000 years ago when we're talking about the Paracas people. You know, he's looking at samples that are 2,000 to 3,000 years old in Paracas. They went back the same route and then sailed east to Peru, or they sailed out of, I don't know, Europe or the Arabian Peninsula around Africa and then around South America. Like, how did they end up? How did they get there? Like, either direction you go, it's a very long journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
And complicated too, because you have to get around major continents.
Yeah. I'm going to get to that at the end here. Let's talk about the skulls and cranial deformation in general. There's all different forms of cranial deformation, including wrapping and binding and plates and wood boards and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back thousands of years. There's recent evidence that some of the early Egyptian pharaohs have these cranial deformations. The problem is that none of the burials have been found of the supposed conehead Egyptians. All we have is the hieroglyphs and the carvings and the statues.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but this has been going on for thousands of years. And the question is why?
Yeah.
Well, in a lot of the history and myths, it was to emulate their ancestors. That's what the general consensus is. So does that mean that there in great antiquity was cranial deformation, or was there a race of people, or was there a culture of people that all had this genetic trait, let's say?
Right.
And at one time in the very far past, I'm going to say, you know, during glacial maximum, the ruling class in the world, which some people call Mu, some people call Atlantis, but all of the cultures that were met by these people, like Viracocha, godlike people came to them and gave them all this information. Maybe they were the coneheads.
Right. I mean, my suspicion is that the practice of cranial deformation is an imitation, and it's an imitation of a certain group of people, maybe that naturally had an elongated skull. Maybe not, because now I'm a little bit unclear because of what you're telling me about, you know, because one of the things that Brian Forster points out is that there are skulls in Peru that are found without what most of us have is this natural sagittal suture. And you're telling me that that can still happen in other humans, which I find kind of a bit unbelievable, honestly.
Let me just pull up the paper here before we dive deeper.
But I will say this, that like, okay, you and I talked about this recently, the idea of like, okay, genetic anomalies potentially being left over from our interactions with other hominids in the past, right? So little Homo floresiensis perhaps is the origin of dwarfism, right? Which we just consider to be some genetic mutation or something. And maybe this is similar. Maybe the lack of having this sagittal suture and this elongated head maybe it's a remnant of another hominid species that we interbred with at some point in the long ago past. And in that sense can be considered part of our genetic makeup today, right?
Yeah.
And maybe explaining why this would pop up periodically in humans. I mean, obviously we're not seeing it now. Not that I'm
Yeah.
aware of anyway.
So this type of binding in
Yeah.
sub-Saharan Africa would be very hard to detect on the skull, and it would lead to Paracas type skulls.
Mhm.
And so that is one of the explanations on how you get, see how long this skull has become due to
But
the binding?
this kid probably still has a sagittal suture, you know?
Well, according to the science, sagittal sutures can disappear as early as 8, but typically between the age of 50 and 70. But there's a number of reasons they can just melt away and fuse. And I have the paper. I just need to find it through all this.
That's really interesting.
And
Okay,
also
I mean,
the
that's really
position-
important to know.
The position of the four-man magnum, you can see here on 2 skulls of humans, they're completely different places.
Yeah.
And this one is the same place as the Paracas skulls. These are not Paracas skulls, they're just human skulls.
Well, it's funny because I was just saying to you yesterday after learning about
You
this.
felt that yours,
Yeah, I was like, you know, the back of my head, like my neck seems really close to the back of my head.
Well, the more I look, you have a little cone head look. Let's get a side profile.
I thought about that too.
Let's get a side profile. There it is, Nefertiti, folks.
It doesn't help that I have a bun on top of my head, but
All right, so we got to really connect this all together, and I'm going to do it here with this picture. These are AI reconstructions of the main Paracas skull with the red hair, with different hairdos, and this is based on knowledge in written text. Do you see how this is wrapped like this?
Mhm.
So if you look at Paracas on a map, I think I have it somewhere. Jesus. Oh, it's right here. So if you look at Peru here, here's Lima. And then there's this little peninsula south of Lima. You blow up on, this is Paracas.
Mhm.
This protruding area would be the most obvious area you're going to land if you're coming in from the ocean.
Mhm.
Okay? The Paracas people, which are these people, have huge geoglyphs way before the Nazca. And they're different than Nazca lines because Nazca lines are made on the flat peneplains, the tops of mesas. All of the Paracas geoglyphs are on hillsides and can only be seen from the ocean. They're visible up to 11 miles away.
Okay.
All right. So now if we go offshore from this peninsula, 11 miles away, we're in the deep Pacific. But if we go straight offshore from here, we hit Rapa Nui. We hit Easter Island.
Yeah,
That's
now I'm
the
wondering
first-
how far away are the Moai visible from?
Well, here's where I'm going to tie it together. These are not red hats. These are the Paracas people's red hair wrapped in a hairdo.
Yeah.
And so there could be a connection that the Paracas people jumped from India through Micronesia, all those islands to Easter Island, and then finally said, hey, let's go west further. And they just went straight west and boom, they hit Paracas.
Right.
Maybe it was at the end of the Ice Age when Easter Island was a huge continent because sea level was 400 feet lower.
Yeah.
And their whole continent was being flooded. And they had to get out and go somewhere.
Yeah.
So that would mean that they actually hit the coast 11,500 years ago.
Yeah.
The oldest genetics that they've sampled, or the oldest archaeology for the Paracas culture, only goes back to 1500 BC, and it just might be that we're missing something.
Yeah, no, and the kind of the layover in Easter Island helps make more sense of the route of travel as well, you know? Like because
so they would have arrived in Easter Island 20 to 15,000 years ago when it was a huge island.
Right.
At glacial maximum, and they would have flourished there.
Yeah.
It's in the middle of the Pacific. It would have been warm. If it's an ice age, that would have been heaven on earth.
Yeah.
Simply because it's surrounded by so much Pacific water that the weather would be the same every day. It'd be 85 every day, perfect every day.
Yeah.
Plus you got occasional freshwater rains due to the trade winds. It would be Atlantis, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I mean, this makes sense particularly in light of the idea of an ancient global culture for a number of reasons, right? There's the cranial deformation that you find around the world, but then there's also this representation of an elongated head that we find all over the world. It's Easter Island, it's the papal hats. It just occurred to me it's also the turbans that you would find, let's say, in like Sikh culture. It's what am I missing here? I mean, it's on and then
Here,
these
the
elongated
Viking women with intentionally reshaped
Oh,
skulls.
look at that. And then it's also, but it even comes up way later than that. Like you and I were talking earlier today about the Huns,
There's a
but
paper on that.
specifically,
Akhenaten and
yeah,
King Gilla of the Huns.
right, which is of course sort of what got me onto this. And there's a specific group of Huns, the Alkan Huns, and they would have followed a this is weird because this is just seems coincidental. Appears to have had a very similar migration from India into the Middle East, into the Caucasus, into Europe, but that is much later. That's 4th century AD. But they have coins of people with elongated heads on them. So it's
Here
still
is
part of the culture
this is
thousands
Alcon
of
the
years
Hun.
later.
This is Alcon the Hun.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
from his coinage from 450 CE. Here you see
Till,
another cone head on a horse.
yeah. 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 It's
This is a female skull found in Hungary in the 5th century.
yeah. Yeah.
There's
Well, and
also
that's
Bavarian.
part of where these haplogroups are.
Yep.
Eastern Europe is a big concentration of these weird little haplogroups that came from somewhere else. Yeah, look at that.
These are from all over the world. We're just going around the world here. Bolivia. And they're all different ways. There we go. Here's a painting by Paul Kane showing Chinookan child in the process of having his head flattened and an adult after the process.
Such a weird thing to do.
Well, and in some of the older texts, it claims that they did it because it made you more beautiful. It was appealing.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? A cone
Yeah.
head?
Right. Well, I keep thinking that, and other people have hypothesized this too, that part of the idea is that this is like literally your cranium being closer to God. Right. So, I mean, perhaps it's an imitation of a group of people that had elongated skulls naturally. Perhaps it is just a function of a belief that this brings you closer to God, and thus why you would typically find groups of royalty performing head binding.
Yeah, so I want to get to, this is fascinating. This is a very famous Egyptian panel with Akhenaten.
Mm-hmm.
Akhenaten's tomb has never been found.
Well, no, supposedly it has been found, and
Oh.
his skull is not elongated.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But if you look at this stela, the babies have elongated skulls, both of them. Let me blow it up.
Does the one on the right doesn't appear to have an elongated skull to me?
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was representing the head binding.
I don't know. It sort of depends on what angle you consider that head at. The other one, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that is kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, and of course you would be doing this.
This would be 1500 BC. The
Yeah.
same time the Paracas people hit, according to those, Peru.
Right.
And there was a big war between this clan and the new coming clan in Egypt, and they destroyed Akhenaten, all his stuff or something. There's a story. They didn't like Akhenaten.
Right.
So maybe the Akhenaten people took a boat and went to Peru.
That could be. Yeah, no, if I don't remember exactly the details, but there is, stories about, well, this is what Akhenaten. Oh no, I'm thinking of his previous name. But that he was kind of a tyrant of sorts, and like people had to like change their names and stuff because he was like declaring himself to be the singular god, and things were getting kind of crazy. But apparently in 1907 there was a rock tomb found with a single mummy in badly preserved condition, and they eventually determined that this is Akhenaten. And this was genetically tested. It was confirmed by genetic testing. And apparently, and the skull is actually kind of flattened. I don't know if you have this article up. Oh, you do. The one about the two god kings.
Yeah.
There's a picture of the skull from this mummy, KV 55. Go down some more. Yeah, right here.
There you go.
That's Akhenaten.
I thought you said he didn't have a cone head.
That's what I'm saying. That's not a cone head. Look how
What is
flat.
this?
That's the back of his skull, but the top of his skull is flat. Oh, so you're suggesting it was elongated out the back?
Yeah, like the Africans.
Yeah, they're calling it an enlarged and flattened cranium. And I guess there was a theory at one point that this was in part like a health condition. Chronic hydrocephalus.
Yeah. So all of the Egyptian pharaohs that they depict like this had a brain injury?
No, I mean, I think the suggestion is that they were depicted in such a way that didn't reflect how they actually were in real life.
Why are they doing it?
Well, because it seems to indicate some kind of royalty or godlikeness or something like that, right? It's an elitist thing. I mean,
Yep.
given the serpents coming out of the front of these people's heads in this image, like the idea that this is like a godlike thing is not that surprising.
No, and it might have something to do with telepathic abilities. A lot of the cultures in Africa and a lot of the cultures in South America think the binding creates smarter children.
Right. Which apparently
it gives you the ability to be godlike.
Right.
So maybe if you have your head binded and your whole life, everyone's telling you you're smarter and godlike, you act that way, maybe you become the ruler.
Right.
And that's the whole process. But this has to come from a time during the glacial maximum where all of this began. I mean, this is tens of thousands of years old, just based on this cursory review. Yeah, no, it has to be. It has to be an extremely old phenomenon. And it's interesting to think about the fact that right now, we're like only in the beginning of not having this in human culture for the first time in many thousands of years. Yeah, that's a good point. What's also interesting is the connection with the fingertips and the hieroglyphs on the back of the moai directly connect with Göbekli Tepe. Yes. There's the swan story. The story on the back of the moai that's buried, the 60-footer, is the same story on Pillar 43. It has the same bird, the same egg. Yeah. And the hats look like the top of the T-pillars. Yeah, and the fingertips here are the same position on the pillars in Göbekli Tepe. Yeah. And then there's that belt thing too that comes up. You know, like there's the belt with the H on it in Göbekli Tepe, and you kind of get that in some of the moai too. Yeah. So the connections keep coming. The Paracas culture, very little is known about them. They've got very few things. They've got a few bottles, but mostly textiles. 3,500 years ago, these people were carving amazing blankets and stuff. Here's an example. Weaving, but yeah. Weaving, yeah. Look, this is a Paracas hat, 2,000-year-old, and more Paracas. Look at that. That's the Easter Island hat. The blue. This. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Looks like a moai. Yeah. Look at this guy. These are called flying men. So I wonder if the Paracas knew how to fly. Right. That's interesting. But the snake coming out of the skull, same as the pharaohs. Yeah. But look, it looks like he ripped off his head and replaced it with this thing. He ripped off his head and he put on an upside down mask. Yeah. And he's a monkey man. Interesting. It says the oculate being. Yeah, where did they come from and why? Well, it all goes back to genetics. The more genetic research we do, I think the better picture of what's happening on Earth will come to light. It's very clear that this haplogroup coming out of Siberia here has nothing to do with sub-Saharan Africa. The Africans 2 million years ago did not suddenly become a different culture. I mean, it's funny when you look at this, it appears as if there's 1, 2, 3, 4 groups of hominins that have mixed. Maybe
Yeah.
5 if you include Australia.
Yeah.
5
Well,
distinct groups of hominids that were not related, did not evolve from a common single ancestor.
And the idea that we're still using this out of Africa hypothesis in light of all of the genetic information that we now have is completely ridiculous. It's the same thing as looking at a 50-year data set, in regards to climate versus the entire geological time scale. It's the same thing. You're ignoring some of the data that's out there. Like the out of Africa hypothesis can't hold water just on this alone.
Yeah, and some of the reasons we're here is because any data that goes against the grain of out of Africa has been hidden, suppressed, or ridiculed for decades.
Mm-hmm. I don't think the genetics don't lie, though.
Rewatch the show on Magnetic Reversal News tonight, 8 p.m. Mountain Time.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.